kind of man rips up a kid's homework in front of a crowd just because of the color of his skin? What kind of town watches and says nothing? And what would you do if the boy everyone judged too quickly turned out to be the one holding a truth no one was ready for? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. It started on a Monday afternoon, one of those early fall days in Georgia where the heat hasn't quite given up, but the air already smells like school and structure. In a small town just outside of Macon, where everybody still waves from porches and most folks know your business before you do, a boy named Deshaun Carter stepped off the bus and walked the 3 blocks to his apartment like he did every day. He had his backpack slung over one shoulder, a composition notebook pressed tightly against his chest, and a pencil tucked behind his ear. At 11 years old, Deshaun was the kind of kid people didn't notice much, not because he didn't deserve attention, but because he didn't demand it. He was quiet, polite, kept to himself, and carried around this calm that seemed older than his years, like he'd already seen enough to know how things worked and didn't expect them to be kind. He'd only been at Franklin Elementary for 3 weeks. His mom had taken a job overseas, and Deshaun was now staying with his great-aunt Rose, a church-going woman who kept her house so clean it made your eyes sting. The move had been sudden. His mom had barely explained anything, just kissed his forehead in the airport and promised she'd be back before Christmas. Since then, he hadn't said much about her. He'd just unpacked his few things, started school, and kept his head down. Most of the kids ignored him. A few whispered about how he talked too proper or acted smart. The teachers noticed he was bright, especially Ms. Wallace, his science teacher, who kept saying he had engineer eyes. But even she hadn't seen the notebook he carried every day, where he wrote out diagrams and sketches and strange little inventions he came up with at night. That day, he wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't doing anything but standing outside a local hardware store, scribbling in his notebook. The store had a broken drainage pipe, and Deshaun had been watching how the water pooled when the AC unit kicked on, thinking through a design he'd been working on to filter dirty water using only household scraps. He was focused, kneeling down, biting his lip as he did his calculations. That's when the sheriff pulled up. Sheriff Ray Dobson had been in that town longer than some of the buildings. He was one of those men people respected because they were supposed to, because he carried a badge, and because he always had. Never mind that he hadn't changed much since the early 90s. People called him old school, which in that town meant he liked to do things his way, didn't believe in political correctness, and made sure everyone knew who was in charge. He didn't know Deshaun, but what he saw was a young black boy crouched in front of a business, writing something on a clipboard, and that was all he needed. He parked, got out, and barked a question from across the sidewalk. "What are you doing here?" Not in a curious way, not even in a concerned way. It was the tone of someone used to getting answers immediately. Deshaun looked up, confused, and stood slowly. "I'm just working on something for school," he said, holding up the notebook. The sheriff walked over, squinting like he didn't believe it. "Let me see that." His hand went out before Deshaun could say anything. The boy hesitated, just enough to make it look like he was resisting, and then handed it over. Dobson flipped through the pages, frowning. There were complex sketches, lines of measurements, not a single word of graffiti or threat. But he didn't seem to care. "Looks like nonsense," he muttered, then held the notebook up and ripped out a handful of pages. Right there, in front of the boy, in front of 2 other adults who had stopped nearby. "Don't loiter around businesses. Go home." Deshaun stood there frozen. The shredded paper drifted to the sidewalk like feathers. He didn't say a word, just picked up his backpack, gathered what was left of the pages, and walked away. The people nearby just looked away. One of them filmed part of it with their phone, but no one intervened. No one said, "Hey, that's just a kid." And no one said that was his homework, because in that town, when the sheriff acted, you didn't question it. You didn't want to be the one standing out. That was the first time anyone really saw Deshaun, and it was for the worst possible reason. The story, of course, got twisted by the time it reached the teacher's lounge the next morning. He was caught sneaking around a storefront, someone said. Something about vandalism. By the time it made it to the PTA moms, Deshaun had been caught tagging the building with symbols, No one asked him. No one asked the school. And even if they had, Deshawn wouldn't have explained. Not because he didn't have the words, but because he knew they wouldn't matter. At school, he didn't mention it. He just showed up with a blank notebook and sat at his desk like nothing had happened. Ms. Wallace noticed something was off, but she didn't press. Not yet. Principal Marla Jennings, though, heard something through a parent, just a passing comment about a boy who needed watching. She pulled up his file. She was the kind of principal who tried to be fair, who smiled more than she scolded, but who also knew how this town worked. She read the file twice. New student, living with a relative, no disciplinary record. Then she saw the emergency contact line, Naomi Carter, overseas deployment, and next to it, a federal code for an undisclosed government agency. Her eyebrows lifted. She made a note in the margin of the file, then sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling like she was trying to remember something. Deshawn kept to himself for the rest of the week. He redrew some of the diagrams from memory, but didn't talk about the project again. He stayed in at recess and ate lunch in the corner. The other kids gave him space now, not out of respect, but because the rumor had spread that he was weird or violent. One kid said he'd been in juvie. Another claimed he'd cursed at the sheriff. None of it was true, but none of it had to be. In small towns, truth doesn't travel as fast as stories do. By Friday, the teachers were already treating him differently, not unkindly, just carefully, like he was glass, or like he might break something. Even Mrs. Wallace, who meant well, started giving him those soft smiles like she didn't know what to say, but felt like she should. Deshawn noticed. He always noticed. He had that kind of mind, the kind that watches, catalogues, understands even when people think he's too young to get it. Sheriff Dobson hadn't mentioned the incident again, but his patrol car passed by the school every day around the same time now, just a slow drive-by, just enough to be seen. And every time, Deshawn's shoulders tensed and his eyes dropped to the floor. That town had a way of making people disappear without ever laying a hand on them. Just a look here, a rumor there, a cold shoulder. It didn't take much. Deshawn Carter was learning that the hard way, but what no one in that town knew, what none of them could have guessed, was that the boy they were trying to erase was the son of someone they had tried to forget, someone who hadn't disappeared at all, someone who was about to come back. But for now, he just sat there, silently rebuilding what had been torn from him, one diagram at a time. The Monday after the incident, the school hallways buzzed with the kind of quiet tension that people pretended not to notice. Franklin Elementary wasn't the kind of school where fights broke out or rumors turned into public drama. It was the kind of place where everything happened in coded language, in glances, in soft whispers between PTA parents and low conversations at the teacher's lounge table. And Deshawn Carter, without even realizing it, had become the center of a conversation he wasn't invited into. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was colder than that. Ms. Wallace noticed it before anyone else. She saw the way the other teachers had stopped mentioning his name during planning periods, how a few of them started using phrases like "at risk" or "emotionally withdrawn" without talking to him directly. She saw how the lunch monitors gave him longer stares than they gave other kids. It was subtle, but it was everywhere, like a film that settled over everything he touched. Deshawn felt it too, of course, but he didn't react. He didn't have the kind of personality that flared up or drew attention. He just pulled back a little more each day, his voice quieter, his steps slower. He stopped raising his hand in class. He stopped asking for help. And when he turned in work, it was always neat, always on time, but it had stopped carrying the little notes he used to include, those extra thoughts in the margins that showed he was thinking far beyond what was expected of a kid his age. He'd erased himself without anyone asking. It was the only way he knew to stay out of the crosshairs. At home, his Aunt Rose didn't say much about it either. She'd heard something about an incident from another woman at church, but all she said was, "You just keep your head straight, baby. Don't give them no reason." That was the rule in her house. Don't give them a reason, not because you did anything wrong, but because they didn't need much of one. She fed him, kept his clothes clean, reminded him to pray at night. But she didn't ask about the notebook, she didn't ask about the sheriff, and Deshawn didn't bring it up. Some silences felt safer. Principal Jennings, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. She'd been in that job long enough to recognize patterns, and this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. She kept replaying the details. A boy working quietly on schoolwork, approached aggressively by law enforcement, publicly humiliated, then quietly labeled as a problem. It didn't feel like a one-time thing. It felt practiced, but she also knew how careful she had to be. There were parents on the school board, and some of them donated to Sheriff Dobson's annual community fundraisers. There were lines she couldn't cross, at least not without backup, so she did what she could within the system. She met with Ms. Wallace behind closed doors and asked for updates. She kept an eye on Deshawn's grades. She flagged his file for priority review, which meant it would get forwarded directly to the district's student support office. But none of that changed what was happening inside the walls of that school every day. On Thursday of that week, something small happened that most people missed. During lunch, one of the 7th grade boys, Corey, a loud kid with too much confidence and not enough supervision, walked by Deshawn's table and made a crack about the little genius writing manifestos. A few kids laughed. It wasn't the worst thing anyone had ever said, but it was enough. Deshawn didn't respond. He just picked up his tray and walked out of the cafeteria. Ms. Wallace saw the whole thing. She followed him, found him sitting on the library floor between two shelves, staring at the cover of a book he wasn't reading. She sat next to him without asking, legs folded, hands in her lap. "You want to talk about it?" she asked gently. He shook his head. She didn't press. They sat like that for nearly 10 minutes in silence. Then, just before she stood to leave, he spoke, almost a whisper. "I had pages. I spent 3 weeks on them. I had it all figured out. The pump, the filter. I was going to show it to the class when it was ready." Ms. Wallace swallowed hard. She'd never heard him speak more than a sentence or two at once. "Can you redraw it?" she asked softly. "I'm trying," he said, "but it's not the same when you don't have the first lines. The first lines help the rest make sense." That sentence stayed with her for days. The first lines help the rest make sense. She knew he wasn't just talking about diagrams anymore. That Friday, Principal Jennings received a call she hadn't expected. It came from a number with a government prefix, one she hadn't seen in a long time. A woman's voice on the other end asked to confirm Deshawn Carter's enrollment and current living situation. She didn't say where she was calling from, only that she was with the agency listed on his file. Jennings answered the questions as neutrally as possible, but before the call ended, she asked a quiet question of her own. "Can you tell me more about Naomi Carter's current position?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice said, "She's not overseas anymore. She's stateside, working remotely under a different title." That night, Principal Jennings didn't sleep much. Over the weekend, the video of the incident outside the hardware store started making its way through local social media again. It wasn't a full video, just 30 seconds of the sheriff pulling the notebook, flipping the pages and tearing them. No sound, no context, but people were starting to notice. Some commenters were sympathetic to the sheriff, others weren't. The debate sparked for about a day, then faded, like these things often do when people get uncomfortable. But one person who saw it didn't forget. His name was Reggie Turner. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town and had grown up in the same county. He didn't go to PTA meetings, didn't volunteer at the school, didn't even vote most years. But when he saw that boy's face in the video, he felt something in his gut that didn't sit right. On Monday morning, he showed up at the school at 7:30 and asked to speak to the principal. Jennings met him in the front office with cautious curiosity. He was quiet, respectful, hands in his jacket pockets. "Saw something online," he said. "That boy Deshawn, he any kin to Naomi Carter?" Jennings blinked. "Why would you ask that?" Turner scratched his jaw. "Because he looks just like her, and because I remember what happened back then." That was all he said. But the look in his eyes told her he hadn't come just to gossip. He'd come because he remembered something the rest of the town had conveniently forgotten. She thanked him, watched him leave, then closed her door and sat in her office for a long time, staring out the window at the kids filing in for the day. Inside the school, Deshawn sat through homeroom in silence. Ms. Wallace placed a fresh pack of graph paper on his desk with a quiet nod. He looked at it, then at her, and for the first time in days, something flickered across his face. Maybe not a smile, but something close. During science, He started sketching again, slowly, carefully. The lines didn't come as easily this time, but he didn't stop. What no one could see, not Ms. Wallace, not the principal, not even Deshawn himself, was that something was beginning to shift. Not in a dramatic way, not with shouting or sudden justice, but in that quiet, steady way that happens when the right people start paying attention, when silence starts to feel like complicity, when the lines that were torn away begin to be redrawn, one stroke at a time. The school day ended like any other. Bells rang, backpacks zipped, and children flooded out into the Georgia afternoon. Deshawn walked home the same way he always did, 3 blocks, past the hardware store, head down. But this time, when he reached the broken drainage pipe, he didn't stop. He didn't take out his notebook, he just walked past it without looking. That night he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the new sheets of graph paper. He didn't draw, he just sat, thinking. Aunt Rose washed dishes behind him, humming softly to herself. Outside, the sheriff's car rolled past the window, slow and deliberate. Deshawn didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just sat there, breathing quiet, steady breaths, and held his pencil like it was the only thing that still made sense in a world that didn't want him to be understood. And for that night, that was enough. By the 3rd week since the incident, Deshawn had become used to the sound of people not knowing what to say around him. It was a strange kind of silence, not empty, not peaceful, but full of tension, the kind that made his ears ring even when the room was quiet. In class, he noticed the way conversations paused when he walked in, how kids who used to ignore him now acted like he might explode if they said the wrong thing. Teachers had started treating him like a glass vase on the edge of a shelf, too delicate to handle, but too visible to ignore. Ms. Wallace was the only one who still spoke to him like he was just a kid, like he was still Deshawn, not some version of a story passed from parent to teacher to playground rumor. She didn't ask him how he felt. She didn't tiptoe, she just let him be, and sometimes that was the only reason he showed up to class at all. What no one else at that school saw, or maybe just didn't want to see, was that Deshawn had been carrying a growing weight since that day on the sidewalk. It wasn't just about the torn pages, it was about the way the sheriff had looked at him, like he'd already made a decision before a single word was said. It was about how the people around them had stayed quiet, like it wasn't their place to speak up, like the power of the badge meant more than the voice of a child. And it was about how afterward, nobody asked him what he'd been working on, nobody asked what he lost. They just moved on, like he should too. At home, things had settled into a routine that didn't include much talking. Aunt Rose wasn't unkind. She made his lunch, folded his clothes, turned down the TV when he did homework, but she wasn't warm either. She had grown up in a different kind of world, one where survival meant keeping your head down and doing what you were told. To her, what had happened with the sheriff wasn't surprising. It was just proof that Deshawn needed to be more careful. When he finally told her, in quiet pieces over dinner one night, how the sheriff had taken his notebook and destroyed it, she didn't flinch. She just looked at him with that same tired face and said, "You're lucky that's all he did. You don't poke the bear, baby. You just stay out of his way." That was the part that stuck with Deshawn. Not the warning, but the calm way she said it, like she'd rehearsed that line 100 times. It made him feel like the world he was trying to build with his ideas and his questions and his notebooks didn't have a place here. That maybe, no matter how smart he was or how well he behaved, someone could still decide he was a threat just by looking at him. The next day at school, things got worse. Corey, the same boy who'd mocked him in the lunchroom, walked by Deshawn's desk during independent reading time and knocked his pencil case to the floor on purpose. It wasn't loud. Most of the class didn't even notice. But when Deshawn picked it up and quietly said, "Please don't do that again," Corey smirked and said loud enough for others to hear, "You gonna call the cops?" "Oh, wait, maybe you already did." A few kids laughed. A few looked away, and Deshawn just sat there, blinking hard, trying not to let it show. Ms. Wallace caught the tail end of it and called Corey into the hallway. No one heard what she said to him, but when he came back in, his face was red and his shoulders were tight. Still, nothing official came of it. No detention, no write-up, just another moment filed away under kids being kids, even though it didn't feel like that to Deshawn. It felt like something uglier pretending to be normal. Principal Jennings heard about the incident later that afternoon from Ms. Wallace, who stopped by her office after the final bell. Wallace wasn't usually one to complain about students. She believed in managing her own classroom, but something about that interaction had crossed a line for her. "He's being targeted," she said simply, "by kids who think it's safe to treat him like this. And they think it's safe because they saw a grown man do it first." Jennings nodded, but her eyes were distant. She had already begun to make quiet inquiries of her own into Deshawn's background, into Naomi Carter's history, into the events that had nearly brought down a sheriff's department a decade ago, but had somehow disappeared before reaching the courthouse. She hadn't shared any of this yet, not with Wallace or anyone else, because she wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly. But something in her gut told her this wasn't just about one child and one bad moment. There was a pattern here, and it had roots. Later that week, Deshawn stayed after school to finish rebuilding his science project. Ms. Wallace had given him permission to use the classroom and had left him alone, trusting him. He sat at a corner table with his backpack open and his new graph paper spread out in neat rows. He didn't rush. He drew slowly, deliberately, like each line was an act of defiance. The system he was designing was a small one, a kind of low-cost filtration setup using recycled containers and gravity-fed flow, but it was smart, clean, and effective. The kind of thing people might ignore at first glance, but that could make a real difference in places that needed it. That was the thing about Deshawn. He didn't just dream big, he dreamed practical. He wanted to fix things, not just for himself, but for anybody who was left to drink dirty water or be treated like they didn't matter. As he worked, the door opened and Principal Jennings stepped inside. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him, noticed the precision of his lines, the steady way his hand moved. After a minute, she spoke. "Your mom," she said carefully. "She's very intelligent, isn't she?" Deshawn froze for a second, then looked up, unsure where the question was going. "Yeah," he said quietly. She's good at everything. She used to help me build stuff, even when she was tired." Jennings nodded, sitting down across from him. "She's working with the government, right? That's what it says on your file." He hesitated, then nodded. "Do you miss her?" He didn't answer at first. Then, almost too softly to hear, he said, "Every day." Jennings smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. "You know, she's very respected. People don't always know what that means, but she stood up to something big once, and it cost her a lot." Deshawn looked at her, his eyes suddenly sharper. "You know her?" "I remember her from a long time ago," she said. "She made people uncomfortable back then, not because she did anything wrong, but because she told the truth when people wanted to keep things quiet." He didn't say anything, but his face changed. A kind of recognition, a kind of pride mixed with confusion. Jennings stood up. "I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this, that sometimes the hardest thing is carrying a name that people pretend to forget. But the people who matter, they remember." She left without waiting for a response, and Deshawn sat there for a long time, pencil still in hand, lines still half drawn, his thoughts swirling too fast to focus. It was the first time in weeks that he felt seen, not just as a student or as a problem, but as someone with history, someone connected to something larger than a small-town rumor. That night, at home, he asked his aunt if she still had the old photo albums. Rose looked surprised, then sighed, wiped her hands on a towel, and pulled a dusty bin from the back of a closet. They sat at the table, flipping through the pages. Deshawn quiet, Rose more talkative than usual. She pointed out pictures of his mom when she was younger, in jeans and t-shirts, holding protest signs, sitting at a lab table, arguing with men in suits, smiling next to a judge. "Your mama always had a fire in her," Rose said. "She didn't like being told to wait her turn." Deshawn stared at one photo of her, standing alone on a courthouse step, her face calm but determined, reporters in the background. "Why doesn't anybody talk about her?" he asked. Rose closed the album. "Because folks like to act like she didn't happen. That's easier than admitting they were wrong." The next morning, Deshawn packed his graph paper carefully, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and zipped his backpack with a new kind of precision. At school, he walked the halls with more intention. The whispers were still there. Corey still made a comment under his breath, but Deshawn didn't shrink from it. He just kept walking. In Ms. Wallace's class, he turned in the first section of his rebuild project. She looked it over, blinked twice, then looked back at him. This is good, she said. It's not done yet, he replied, but it's gonna work. And when he said it, he wasn't just talking about the filter system, he was talking about everything. By the time the fourth week rolled around, the quiet tension around Deshawn had started to take root in places that went beyond the classroom. It was in the way other parents paused when they saw him walking beside his aunt in the grocery store, in the cautious tones teachers used when his name came up during meetings, in the subtle discomfort of people realizing he wasn't just a one-time problem they could forget about. He had stayed, endured, and now he was becoming something harder to ignore, a reminder that not everything about the town was as fair and decent as folks like to believe. And for a place like Franklin, which prided itself on small-town values and tight-knit community, that was more unsettling than anyone wanted to admit. In Ms. Wallace's class, he continued building out his filtration project with steady focus. The new design was more complex than the first one, more ambitious. He had started experimenting with different types of containers and absorption materials, coffee filters, charcoal powder, even strips of old t-shirts. He tested how each affected the flow rate, how clean the water came out at the end, and which combinations worked best with gravity alone. He kept notes in tight, legible handwriting, filled the margins with observations and ideas for future prototypes, and labeled everything in both English and metric units, just like his mum had taught him. Ms. Wallace was quietly stunned by the depth of his thinking. She had taught science for almost 12 years, but she had never seen a student his age plan and execute something this advanced with so little support. She offered suggestions where she could, usually in the form of open-ended questions, but mostly she just gave him space and resources, letting him lead. Still, despite his growing confidence inside the classroom, things outside of it weren't improving. Corey and his friends had shifted tactics. They didn't mock Deshawn directly anymore. That had gotten them too much attention. Instead, they whispered just loud enough to be heard, made vague comments about kids who think they're better than everyone, and started claiming that Deshawn was the principal's pet. Other students, especially the ones on the fringe who followed whatever group seemed safest, began to treat him like an outsider by default. Not hated, not feared, but quietly othered, isolated without a clear cause. He wasn't invited to birthday parties. No one asked him to join group projects unless Ms. Wallace assigned him directly. His name became something people used as a reference point, but never as part of a conversation. And even though Deshawn never complained, not to teachers, not to his aunt, not even to himself, it wore on him. You could see it in his eyes, the way they stayed a little tired, even when he smiled. At home, Aunt Rose had started paying closer attention. She didn't say much, but she'd begun watching him when he wasn't looking, noting how long he spent on his schoolwork, how often he stared out the window during dinner. One night, she asked if he wanted to go to the community center with her on Saturday. They were hosting a fundraiser for a local church that was trying to expand its youth programs. It was the kind of event she usually went to alone, but something in her made her reach out this time. Deshawn hesitated, then nodded. "I'll go," he said. "I think it might be good to get out for a while." That Saturday, they arrived early. The gym had been converted into a long row of folding tables covered in plastic cloths, each one filled with baked goods, handmade crafts, or flyers for church services and community programs. There were kids running around, old men sipping coffee in the corner, and women catching up in loud, affectionate tones. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of life. Deshawn stayed close to his aunt at first, helping her set up a table of pound cake slices she had made made the night before. But after a while, he started to drift, drawn to a booth that had a display of hand-built electronics kits. An older man in a denim apron stood behind it, demonstrating how a simple motor circuit worked. His name tag read, Reggie Turner. Reggie recognized Deshawn immediately, though he didn't say so. Instead, he waved him over and asked, "You like building stuff?" Deshawn nodded. "What kind?" Reggie asked, genuinely curious. "Water systems," Deshawn said. "Mostly filtration. I'm working on one for a science fair, trying to use stuff that's easy to find." Reggie raised an eyebrow. "Like what? Plastic bottles, charcoal, gravity." Reggie let out a soft laugh. "Sounds like someone knows what they're doing." They talked for nearly half an hour. Deshawn explained his design, answered questions with clear logic, and even corrected one of Reggie's assumptions about surface area and flow resistance. At the end of their conversation, Reggie reached under the table and handed him a small bag of leftover components: wires, alligator clips, a couple of LED lights, and a switch. "I usually save these for kids who've got something cooking in their heads," he said. "Looks like you've got more than a few ideas in yours." Deshawn took the bag with a quiet thank you, his face lighting up with a mix of surprise and gratitude. Aunt Rose watched from a distance, her arms folded, but her expression softer than usual. When they left the event, she didn't say much, just ruffled his hair in the car and told him he did good. But not everyone was pleased to see Deshawn making connections. Later that week, Corey's mom, who also happened to be a prominent voice in the PTA, sent an email to Principal Jennings. It was worded politely, but the message was clear. She was concerned that certain students were being given special treatment, and she wanted to know why Deshawn Carter had been allowed to use school materials unsupervised, why he had been left alone in classrooms after hours, and why he seemed to be receiving preferential attention from multiple staff members. She ended the email by reminding the principal that fairness was essential to community trust. Jennings read it twice, then printed it out and placed it in a drawer. She didn't reply right away. She knew how these things worked, how concern was often a cover for resentment, how fairness only became a priority when certain kids started doing better than expected. But she also knew she couldn't let it slide completely. She scheduled a meeting with Ms. Wallace, shared the content of the message, and asked her, as delicately as possible, to be mindful of optics. Wallace stared at her. "You're asking me not to support him as much. I'm asking you to document it," Jennings said quietly. "Everything you do, so no one can twist it later." The conversation left both women tired. It wasn't new, but it never got easier, walking that thin line between protecting a student and protecting your own ability to stay in the room at all. Still, Wallace nodded. She would do it, not because she agreed with the pressure, but because she knew what was at stake. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dobson had started hearing rumblings of his own. The video of the incident had made a few more rounds online, and someone had tipped off a local journalist from a progressive blog that covered small-town politics. The reporter hadn't published anything yet, but she had sent an official request to the department for a comment. Dobson didn't respond, but the request alone was enough to rattle him. He wasn't used to being questioned, not by outsiders, not by anyone. He started showing up at the school again, lingering near the parking lot at dismissal, walking through the halls under the pretense of a safety review. Jennings couldn't stop him without making a scene, but she made it clear he wasn't to speak to any students without her present. He nodded, smiled politely, and did what he wanted anyway. One afternoon, Deshawn caught him watching through the glass of the office while he walked down the hallway. Their eyes met, just for a second. No words were exchanged, but the look in Dobson's face wasn't curiosity, it was possession, the look of someone who believed he still controlled the narrative, still controlled who mattered and who didn't. That evening, back at home, Deshawn sat at the kitchen table with the bag of components Reggie had given him. He laid them out in careful rows, sketching out how they might fit into his filtration system, not because they were necessary, but because they gave him new ways to think. He worked until his eyes burned, then leaned back and looked at the design as a whole. It was cleaner now, stronger, like it could withstand more pressure without breaking. His aunt brought him a plate of food and said, "You keep going like this? You're going to build something they can't ignore?" He didn't answer. just nodded once. He was starting to understand that some things couldn't be ignored forever. Not ideas, not injustice, and not the truth about where he came from. That was the part they had all underestimated. By the 5th week, something had shifted in the way Deshawn carried himself. It wasn't a dramatic change, not the kind people would point to and say, "Look, he's different now." But something had hardened under the surface. He was still quiet, still polite, still doing his work with the same steady care, but his silence had taken on weight. It was no longer the silence of fear or withdrawal. It was the silence of someone who had learned to expect more from himself than from anyone else. It was the silence of someone who'd stopped waiting for things to be fair. At school, the whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. Corey still made comments, but less often and with less confidence. Some of the kids who used to laugh at his jokes had started to pull away, not because they felt guilty, but because the situation was becoming murkier. No one wanted to be the one who crossed a line now that the adults were paying more attention. Ms. Wallace continued to support Deshawn openly, documenting every step of the project, every assignment submitted, every piece of feedback she gave him. It made everything slower, more rigid, and she hated that, but it was necessary. Because the moment someone decided to question her motives, or worse, his right to be supported, she needed a paper trail they couldn't argue with. Principal Jennings had grown more cautious too. She had started keeping a folder in her locked drawer, separate from Deshawn's official file, filled with notes, printed emails, and copies of old articles. Late at night, after the school emptied out and her office lights were the last to go dark, she would open it and reread the few pieces she had managed to dig up about Naomi Carter's case. The story hadn't been easy to find. It had never reached national headlines, never made it to trial, but local activists had written about it, and a few blogs had archived pieces of it over the years. The details were unsettling. A young woman, barely in her 20s, who had filed a complaint against 2 deputies after an unlawful stop. Claims of intimidation, retaliation, a legal battle that went quiet almost as quickly as it began. And then she disappeared, changed her name, left the area, took a federal job, and kept her head down. The more Jennings read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a sheriff and a science project. This was about history repeating itself. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dobson was growing restless. He felt it, the pressure, the sideways glances, the unspoken questions. He was used to being in control, used to walking into rooms and having people fall quiet with respect or fear. But now, there were cracks. Jennings had stopped answering his calls with the same clipped politeness. Teachers no longer offered their usual passive approval when he walked the halls. And that blog, the one that had sent the inquiry, had published a small article, just a few hundred words, but enough to catch attention. It didn't name him directly, but it referenced an incident involving a black student, a torn science notebook, and a local law enforcement officer. It hinted at a troubling pattern of behavior tied to unresolved complaints from years earlier. The comments were divided. Some people defended him, others didn't. He started showing up more often, not just at the school, but around town, lingering at the diner, making small talk at the grocery store, shaking hands at the church fish fry. He reminded people of who he was and what he represented: law, order, familiarity, and most folks played along, smiling politely, even when their eyes didn't quite meet his anymore, because whether they believed in what he did or not, Sheriff Dobson was still power in that town, and power didn't shift easily. Back in Ms. Wallace's classroom, Deshawn's project was nearing completion. He had rebuilt his filtration system with more precision than before. The tubes were tighter, the measurements cleaner, the whole structure more stable. He had incorporated the materials Reggie gave him into a small side unit that detected turbidity through light refraction, a simple but effective way to show when water wasn't safe to drink. When he tested it for the class, even the students who'd ignored him before leaned in. Not because they suddenly liked him, but because what he'd built worked. The water went in cloudy and came out clear. The LED lit up when the sample was dirty, stayed off when it was clean. There was something about seeing that happen in real time, in front of their own eyes, that broke through the noise of whatever else they'd heard about him. After class, Ms. Wallace walked over and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You know this is bigger than a school project, right?" she said. He looked at her, steady and quiet, and nodded. "Yeah, I know." The science fair was still a month away, but she had already started talking to the district about his entry. She knew there would be pushback. She'd seen it before, in smaller ways. Kids who were too smart, too confident, too outside the mold. But she also knew she had to try, because what he'd built wasn't just clever, it was meaningful, and more than that, it was a statement. That weekend, Deshawn asked his aunt if she could take him to the county library. She agreed, surprised but pleased. He spent hours there, digging through books and databases, taking notes, printing articles, not just on engineering or science, but on legal rights, public records, historical cases. He had started to connect things in his mind, pieces that had been floating since the moment the sheriff tore his notebook in half. He wasn't just rebuilding a project anymore. He was trying to understand why people like him, like his mom, were always expected to prove themselves twice as hard just to be left alone. One night, while Rose folded laundry in the living room, Deshawn finally asked, "Why didn't Mom ever come back here? Like after everything?" She didn't answer right away. She set a towel down, smoothed it out, and said, "Because sometimes it's safer to be invisible than to be right." But she wasn't wrong. "No," Rose said, "she wasn't. But that don't always matter to the people in charge." Deshawn nodded, looking down at the book in his lap. He already knew that. He just wanted to hear someone else say it. Later that week, Principal Jennings got a call from someone she hadn't heard from in years. It was brief, just a few minutes, but when she hung up, her face had changed. She sat at her desk for a long time after that, staring out the window, the phone still in her hand. Then she opened her drawer, pulled out the folder, and placed it flat on the desk. She didn't open it, just looked at it, thinking. Outside, the school day moved on. Kids laughed in the hallways, bells rang, lunch was served. But underneath all of it, the air felt heavier, like the town was holding its breath, not because something loud had happened, but because the silence was getting harder to keep. And still, Deshawn kept drawing, kept building, kept learning, not because anyone told him to, but because he knew that if he stopped now, they'd win. Not just the sheriff, not just the kids who mocked him, but the entire idea that someone like him wasn't supposed to belong. He didn't know exactly what his mother had gone through, not yet, but he was starting to feel the shape of it piece by piece, and the more he felt it, the more determined he became to finish what he started. Not just the project, the story, his story, and hers. The 6th week came with the kind of cold that Georgia rarely saw that time of year. The mornings were crisp, the light thinner, and the air had a quiet bite that settled in your bones if you stood still too long. At Franklin Elementary, the heater clicked on more often, making the classrooms hum with low static, and kids walked the hallways with sleeves pulled over their hands. But if the weather had changed, the atmosphere around Deshawn remained the same. Still tense, still cautious, still full of sideways glances and conversations that stopped when he walked into a room. He had learned to live with it, like one learns to live with noise from a highway just outside their window. Not because it goes away, but because your body learns how to carry it without showing strain. In class, Deshawn kept his head down and his pencil moving. The final phase of his project was almost done, and he had started to think not just about how it worked, but how to explain it to people who didn't expect kids like him to speak with confidence. Ms. Wallace had offered to help him practice, even printing out rubrics from past district fairs and showing him how to structure a presentation. He took notes, nodded, asked smart questions, and even cracked a quiet joke once that made her laugh harder than she meant to. They had found a rhythm between them, a kind of unspoken understanding that wasn't soft or sentimental, but built on mutual respect. He trusted her because she never tried to rescue him. She just made sure he had room to keep going. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything found its way to the surface. One afternoon, during a break between periods, Ms. Ms. Wallace stepped out to make copies, and when she came back, she found Deshawn sitting perfectly still at his desk, staring straight ahead. His face didn't show anything, but his hands were clenched so tightly around his pencil that the wood had snapped clean in two. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She just handed him another pencil from the drawer and said, "Let me know if you need more." He took it without speaking and went back to work, but for the rest of the day, he didn't look up once. Later that week, Reggie Turner came by the school. He wasn't a teacher, didn't have a kid enrolled, didn't wear a visitor's badge unless someone reminded him, but no one questioned him either. He had grown up in that town, seen it change and stay the same in all the ways that mattered. He dropped off a small box for Deshawn, salvaged parts from an old radio system, carefully cleaned and labeled, and left without fanfare. Ms. Wallace found it on her desk and brought it to Deshawn after school. His face lit up in the smallest way, the corners of his mouth twitching like he'd almost smiled before he caught himself. "Tell him I said thank you," he murmured. Wallace nodded, though she knew Reggie wasn't expecting anything in return. At home, Aunt Rose had started asking more questions. Not nosy, not suspicious, but more like someone who was finally realizing how far beneath the surface things had been brewing. She noticed how late Deshawn stayed up some nights, heard him moving around in his room past midnight, rustling papers, flipping pages. She asked him once if he was sleeping okay, and he shrugged and said, "I'm just thinking." That was all she got. But she also saw the difference in the way he spoke now. His voice was firmer. He didn't trail off like before, didn't wait for permission to finish a sentence. It wasn't arrogance, just clarity. He had started walking taller, not because anything had gotten easier, but because he was tired of shrinking. One evening, she sat him down at the kitchen table with a bowl of cornbread and greens and said, "You know your mama didn't leave this place because she was scared." Deshawn looked up, surprised by the sudden turn in conversation. Rose went on, "She left because she knew if she stayed, they'd keep trying to put her in a box too small for her, and that girl had too much fight in her to let that happen." He nodded slowly, chewing in silence. "I think I'm starting to understand what she was up against." Rose's eyes softened. "Then maybe you're closer to her than you thought." At school, Principal Jennings had become even more deliberate in her movements. She had stopped trying to appease the parents who sent her veiled complaints and started focusing on what she could actually protect. She had tightened up staff protocols, made it mandatory for any adult speaking to a student about behavior to log it officially, and began requesting weekly reports on any disciplinary referrals involving black students across all grades. She knew it wouldn't fix everything, but she needed data. She needed proof. Because what had been happening wasn't just about one boy and one sheriff. It was about an entire pattern of treatment that people pretended didn't exist until it was written down in black and white. She had also started preparing for what she knew might come next. If the pressure kept building, if the story grew louder, someone would try to discredit Deshawn or her, or both. That's how it always went when people in power felt threatened. So she reached out to a contact she hadn't spoken to in years, a lawyer who used to work in civil rights litigation before switching to education policy. She explained the situation carefully, leaving out names, but laying out the facts. The lawyer listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "You need to find out exactly who his mother is, and you need to do it soon." Jennings hung up with her pulse racing. She sat alone in her office as the sky outside darkened, thinking of all the pieces that were slowly locking into place. Some too fast, others not fast enough. There was only so much she could shield, but she had made up her mind. She would not let this school be the place where another generation of kids learned that staying quiet was the only way to survive. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dobson had gone quiet, too quiet. He still showed up in his cruiser, still walked through the town like it belonged to him, but the forced smiles had slipped away. He was watching now, waiting, listening. He had heard about the science project, he had heard about the blog article, and he had definitely heard that people were starting to ask questions about Naomi Carter again, a name he thought he'd buried long ago. He wasn't used to ghosts coming back, especially not ones that looked him in the eye through their children. He called a meeting with 2 school board members under the guise of discussing student safety. They met at a diner, sat in the back booth, and spoke low. He didn't mention Deshawn directly, but his message was clear. The school needed to keep things under control, stop drawing attention. One of the board members, a woman who had grown up in town, nodded along with every word. The other, a man who had moved in only a few years ago and didn't have the same sense of loyalty, said less. He watched Dobson carefully, asked a few questions, then left early, citing another meeting. Dobson didn't like that. He didn't like variables. That same week, Deshawn was called to the principal's office during second period. When he arrived, Jennings was sitting behind her desk with a folder in front of her and a softness in her voice that caught him off guard. "Have a seat, Deshawn," she said. He did, clutching his backpack like a shield. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she turned the folder around and opened it to a page that showed a photo of a younger woman standing on the steps of a courthouse. Her jaw was tight, her posture defiant. "Do you know who this is?" He looked at it and nodded without hesitation. "That's my mom," Jennings nodded back. "She did something brave a long time ago. She tried to hold someone accountable when no one else would. She lost," Deshawn said quietly. "She didn't win in court," Jennings replied. "But she wasn't wrong, and people remember that." He didn't speak again, but something in his eyes shifted, a kind of recognition, a confirmation of something he'd been carrying but hadn't been sure of until now. Jennings closed the folder gently. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I see you, not just for what you've built, but for who you are." Deshawn stood slowly, gripping the straps of his backpack. "Thank you," he said, and his voice didn't waver. He left the office with his head a little higher, and when he returned to class, Ms. Wallace didn't ask where he'd been. She just smiled at him as he walked in and gestured to his seat like it was the most normal thing in the world. That day, during lunch, Deshawn pulled out his notebook and began writing something that wasn't part of his project. It was a speech, still rough, still messy, but full of ideas he hadn't known how to say until now. He didn't know if he'd ever give it, but he needed to write it, to put the words somewhere outside of himself. Words about legacy, about power, about being seen. The noise around him hadn't gone away, but it was no longer the only thing he heard. By the 7th week, the energy around Deshawn had changed, but not in a way that made things easier. If anything, the tension had deepened. It wasn't just kids watching him anymore, it was adults. Teachers who used to smile politely now looked twice before speaking. Administrators hesitated when his name came up in meetings, and even the staff who had always considered themselves allies had started to treat him like a fragile package. It wasn't malicious, but it was performative, and he could feel it in the way their kindness bent around discomfort, like they weren't sure if they were supporting him or protecting themselves. It made every interaction feel heavy, even when people thought they were helping. Still, he pushed forward. He worked on his filtration project every day after school, tightening the mechanics and preparing the final display. Ms. Wallace cleared out a space in the science lab just for him, so he could run tests without distractions. She had also helped him prep a board that would explain the project in simple terms. Though Deshawn insisted on including the technical breakdown too, he said it wasn't enough to show that it worked. He wanted people to understand why it worked. He wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. He just wanted to prove, mostly to himself, that he could take something broken and make it better. But outside the classroom, other things were unraveling. Principal Jennings had received another email from the PTA board, this one more pointed than the last. It questioned her leadership, criticized her handling of recent student discipline disparities, and referenced unnamed concerns from parents who felt the environment at Franklin Elementary had become politicized. It didn't name Deshawn, but it didn't need to. She sat at her desk reading the email 3 times before forwarding it to the district superintendent with a note, "We need to talk." Then she closed her laptop, folded her hands in front of her, and stared at the framed photo of her first class as a teacher. Kids grinning in mismatched socks, arms around each other, no idea yet how the world would try to divide them. That same week, Reggie Turner came back to the school, this time with purpose. He wasn't dropping off parts or checking in. He had asked to speak to Principal Jennings directly. She met him in her office, offered him coffee, and waited while he gathered his thoughts. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke with weight. "I remember Naomi," he said, from back in the day. She used to come to community meetings, sit in the front, ask hard questions. Folks didn't like that, said she was too loud, too smart, said she should be more grateful. Jennings nodded but didn't interrupt. I was there when she stood up at that town hall. Sheriff Dobson tried to talk over her. She didn't back down. That's when things turned. I saw what they did, how they twisted her words, painted her as angry. She wasn't angry. She was right. Reggie paused, then leaned forward slightly. You know she didn't lose that case because she was wrong. She lost it because they made it disappear. She made too many people uncomfortable, so they buried her story and made sure she had to leave if she wanted to stay safe. Jennings let the words settle. Her son's here now, she said softly, and it feels like they're trying to do it again. Reggie looked her in the eye. Then you gotta make sure they don't. After he left, she opened the file again, the one she'd been building week by week, piece by piece. It wasn't official. It didn't exist in the school system, but it was full of truths that too many people had worked hard to forget. She added Reggie's name to it, along with a summary of their conversation, and then she made a decision. The next morning, she stood in front of the staff during their regular faculty meeting and spoke clearly, without notes. She reminded them of their duty, not to maintain appearances, not to keep peace with parents or donors, but to protect their students, especially the ones most vulnerable to being erased. She didn't say Deshawn's name either. She didn't have to. The room was quiet when she finished. No one clapped, but something had landed. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dobson had started to feel his grip slipping. He still held power, still wore the badge, but the town had changed just enough to make him uneasy. There were more new families now, more teachers who had lived in other places, more students whose parents didn't see silence as loyalty. He heard that people were whispering about the past again, about Naomi Carter, about what had been done. It made him uneasy. He'd built his career on being the final word, the man who knew what needed to be done and did it without apology. And now, this boy, this quiet, unassuming boy, was opening old wounds just by showing up and refusing to be small, so he made a visit. It was late afternoon when Deshawn was called to the front office. He was told there was a visitor who needed to speak with him. Ms. Wallace was still in class and didn't know. Principal Jennings had been pulled into a district meeting off-site. That left only the front office assistant, who hadn't been fully briefed on protocol. Sheriff Dobson was waiting near the benches in the lobby. His uniform was crisp, his hands resting lightly on his belt. When Deshawn entered, he looked up and offered a tight smile. "Hey there, son," he said. "Just wanted to have a quick word." Deshawn stopped several feet away, his body still. He didn't answer. Dobson tilted his head slightly. "I hear you've been busy. Science projects, news articles, people digging up stories from years ago. That kind of attention isn't always good, you know. It stirs things up, makes life harder than it needs to be." Still, Deshawn said nothing, but his hands clenched. Barely. Dobson took a step closer. "Your mama, she stirred things up too. Thought she could change how things worked around here. Thought if she made enough noise, someone would listen. You know how that ended." At that moment, Ms. Wallace walked into the office, having come down early to check on something. She stopped short, saw the scene, and her expression turned cold. "What's going on here?" she asked, stepping between them. Dobson smiled, backing up slightly. "Just saying hello. No harm done." But Wallace didn't look away. "This student doesn't meet with visitors unsupervised, you know that." Dobson tipped his hat, gave one last look at Deshawn, and left. The moment the door closed behind him, Wallace turned to Deshawn and asked if he was okay. He nodded, but his face was pale, his jaw locked. She didn't press. She just walked him back to class, sat with him until his hands stopped shaking, and made a note to call Principal Jennings immediately. That evening, Jennings filed a formal complaint with the school district about Dobson's behavior. She also contacted a civil liberties organization she had worked with during a diversity training 2 years prior. Not because she wanted a lawsuit, but because she needed someone to be watching, someone outside the reach of local pressure. The walls were closing in, and she had no intention of letting Deshawn stand alone. At home, Deshawn said nothing to Aunt Rose about the visit. He just ate dinner quietly, went to his room, and spent the next 2 hours revising the speech he'd been writing. It had started as a reflection, but now it was something else, a declaration. He didn't know if he'd get to read it, didn't even know who it was for anymore, but the words were coming out of him fast, like they'd been waiting there all along. That night, as Rose passed by his room on the way to bed, she paused at the doorway. He was sitting at his desk, eyes fixed on the page, pencil moving like it was chasing something. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there for a moment, watching him, her heart full and heavy at the same time. He looked like his mother when he was focused, like someone who refused to disappear. The next morning, Ms. Wallace handed Deshawn a small envelope. Inside was a printed invitation to a school-wide assembly the following week, celebrating voices, a day of student innovation and reflection. She had created the event overnight, pitched it to Jennings, and gotten it approved in record time. There would be presentations from each grade, a showcase of student work, and a keynote speaker. The speaker hadn't been announced yet. Deshawn looked up at her with quiet understanding. "Is this because of yesterday?" She didn't answer directly, just said, "It's because people need to listen." He nodded, and for the first time since the beginning of everything, he smiled. Not out of happiness, but out of readiness. The story wasn't over, but he was no longer waiting to be written into it. The day of the assembly arrived under a soft gray sky, the kind that wrapped the town in a kind of heavy stillness. At Franklin Elementary, teachers bustled around the gymnasium setting up chairs, lining up colorful displays of student projects along the walls. There were paper rockets from the second graders, essays from the fifth graders, a handful of art collages from the older kids, and near the center of it all, Deshawn's filtration system. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have moving parts or bright decorations. It was simple. 2 clear containers, a network of tubes, a small light that blinked only when the water wasn't clean enough to drink. But it stood there quietly, steady and strong, like it didn't need to shout to prove it belonged. Students filled the gym, shuffling into rows of metal chairs. Parents followed, buzzing with the kind of energy that always comes when people gather to watch their children shine. Sheriff Dobson was there too, standing near the back with his arms crossed, sunglasses hooked in the neck of his shirt, even though there was no sun inside. Principal Jennings took the microphone first, welcoming everyone, thanking the teachers, complimenting the hard work of the students. Her voice was calm, but every word she spoke felt anchored in something deeper. She wasn't just hosting an event, she was holding a line. After the first few grade levels presented their work, it was time for the final section, the student-led innovations. Ms. Wallace stepped up and introduced Deshawn simply. She didn't oversell it, didn't try to shield him with praise. She just said, "Here's Deshawn Carter. He's going to explain something he built that could change lives." Then she stepped back. Deshawn walked to the center of the gym with his notebook in one hand and a small folded piece of paper in the other. He was wearing his best shirt, blue and crisp, tucked neatly into his pants, and his sneakers had been scrubbed clean the night before by Aunt Rose, who sat now 3 rows back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When he reached the microphone, he didn't fidget or shuffle his papers. He just stood still for a moment, looking out at the crowd, letting his breath settle. Then he spoke. He explained the science first, breaking it down simply so everyone could understand. He talked about why clean water mattered, how it wasn't always available in every community, how simple materials could make a difference when more expensive solutions weren't an option. He showed how the system worked, pouring murky water into one end and letting it run through until clear, drinkable water came out the other. The small light stayed dark, signaling success. The audience applauded politely, impressed, but still treating it like a school project. Then Deshawn unfolded the second paper. His voice changed, not louder but fuller. "I didn't build this just for school," he said. "I built it because people forget sometimes that small things matter, that small places, small people matter." The room quieted. "My mum grew up here. Some of you might remember her, Naomi Carter. She stood up once when things weren't fair. She tried to fix something bigger than herself, and when she did, people didn't listen. They said she was angry. They said she should be quiet. They tore down what she built before it could grow." He paused, looking down at the machine, then back at the crowd. "I'm not angry. I'm not here to fight anyone. I'm here because I believe the small things we build, the ones nobody notices right away, they matter, they last, even when people try to tear them up." In the silence that followed, you could have heard a pin drop. Some parents looked uncomfortable, others looked at him with something closer to wonder. Even the kids, normally so restless, sat still. From the back of the gym, Sheriff Dobson shifted his weight, jaw tightening. Deshawn finished by thanking Ms. Wallace, Principal Jennings, and Reggie Turner for helping him when he needed someone to believe he wasn't a problem to be fixed, but a builder to be encouraged. He didn't mention the sheriff. He didn't have to. The air was thick with everything that didn't need to be said. When he stepped down, the applause was hesitant at first, scattered. Then it grew, louder and fuller until the whole gym was clapping. Not the kind of loud, obligatory clapping adults sometimes do at school events, but the real kind. The kind that happens when people realize they just witnessed something honest. Jennings stood too, hands steady, and even Ms. Wallace wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. Afterward, during the open house portion, people wandered through the displays. Parents pointed to projects, teachers guided conversations, students beamed with pride. At Deshawn's table, a line formed, small, awkward at first, but real. People asking questions, complimenting his work, shaking his hand. Reggie Turner stood by quietly, smiling, not needing to say much. Aunt Rose came up and hugged him so tightly that for a moment he couldn't breathe, but he didn't mind. Sheriff Dobson didn't stay long. He lingered near the doorway for a few minutes watching, then slipped out while no one was looking. Maybe he knew there wasn't anything left for him to control here. Maybe he realized that the power he thought he had wasn't enough to silence a boy who understood the strength of quiet resilience. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Slowly but surely. The district began a formal review of the school's policies on student treatment and visitor conduct. Principal Jennings submitted her report, backed by testimonies from teachers, staff, and even a few parents. Sheriff Dobson's patrols around the school stopped. The blog that had first hinted at the story published a follow-up, this time naming names, this time telling the story the way it deserved to be told. Deshawn's project was selected to move on to the regional science fair. It wasn't just a ribbon or a certificate. It was a validation of all the work he had done, all the things he had fought to hold on to when it would have been easier to give up. But when Ms. Wallace told him the news, he just smiled a little and said, "That's good," because by then he already knew his worth didn't come from trophies. At home, life went on much the same. Aunt Rose still made cornbread on Sundays, still fussed at him to clean his room, still prayed over him before bed. But there was something softer in her now, something that had opened up. She asked more questions. She listened more closely. She let him be not just her nephew, but a person finding his own way. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Deshawn. It was postmarked from Washington, D.C. Inside was a short note, written in familiar, neat handwriting. "I saw the video of your speech. I'm proud of you. Keep building. They can tear up papers. They can tear down walls. But they can't tear apart the truth you carry. I'll be home soon. Love, Mom." He sat with the letter for a long time before tucking it into the back of his notebook, the one filled now with new diagrams, new ideas. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. He just felt steady, anchored in a way he hadn't before. At school, when he walked the halls, people still watched him, but it was different now. They saw him not as a problem to be managed, but as a reminder that silence isn't strength and resilience isn't noise. It's the quiet, steady work of building something better, even when the world tries to convince you you're wasting your time. And so Deshawn kept going, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the unshakable knowledge that small things matter, that voices matter, that the first lines he drew, the ones they tried to tear away, were just the beginning of something bigger than they could ever erase. If this story touched you, comment with the word resilience, because that's what builds bridges between where we are and where we're meant to be. And if you want more, there's a story here on the screen that will also move you. Press play, you won't regret it.